Jeffrey Epstein was recently utterly destroyed in a way he will never recover from. Now, why was that? Well, I'll tell you. It's because he let his desires utterly control him. So for those who aren't watching this in 2019, what exactly did Jeffrey Epstein do? Well, it's pretty simple. He ran a sex slave ring with children as young as 14 up to young adulthood. Pretty fucked up stuff on its own. And then you learn that he partook in it pretty strongly as well. And lots of very, very powerful people who could have their careers destroyed were also involved in it. Kind of makes sense when you think about it why he was a billionaire. Because if he had clips of those sorts of things, could destroy a man, couldn't it? I kind of suspect that this kind of silly behaviour would eventually trip him up, because eventually you're going to have somebody who's wound up enough by that sort of antic that they're going to come and stitch you. And that's what Jeffrey Epstein has been going through for the last 13 years, since 2006 in fact, and he's been dragged through the courts again and again and again, and it seems as if they finally reached a conclusion that the man is going to go to prison and he's never going to come out. And why was that? Because he couldn't control himself. A more relatable example, Bill Clinton, somebody utterly controlled by his passions, almost lost his presidency over his passions. And, I mean, you can go and look up the storied past of Bill Clinton when it comes to being Slick Willie. I mean, this guy, you could give him a stick of butter and a grate in the street and he'd bang it if that was the only alternative he had. And of course, Slick Willie still has a career, but you can tell it's really taken its toll on him. I mean, him and Hillary, they look like zombies. You surely remember back in 2016 when Hillary almost fell down a flight of stairs. She was clearly not well. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that she was aware of what her husband was doing. I mean, as much as Hillary Clinton is a reprehensible person in herself, it must fuck with her on a certain level. And, I mean, you can even see it on Chelsea's face. There's a lot of stress there. Probably because of how utterly controlled Bill is by his passions. You know, they say follow your passions. No, bullshit, don't do that. You can see the results in Bill and in Hillary. And then we finally reach the archetype, and that is Samson and Delilah, a story that I think everyone can relate to. So, in essence, Samson is the judge of Israel, which is essentially like a warlord or almost a king, right? And he finds this woman pretty attractive, this girl called Delilah, and Delilah is associated with his enemies, the Philistines. And she tries to sleep with him out of marriage. And she wears him down utterly, again and again. I think it's 4 times in the story. She wears him down, and he keeps saying, no, I'm a Nazarite, which means he's consecrated to God. And it wears him down over time, and eventually he just goes, fuck it, and then bangs her. And she cuts his hair, which was the source of his strength, that she learnt through, nagging him to death. And this is what ultimately gets him arrested and thrown into exile with the Philistines, because the Philistines want to get him. And they get him through this act. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that in the Jewish scriptures and in the Christian scriptures, the hair in the Old Testament represents the soul. So by cutting Samson's hair, she effectively took his soul. And I think a good chunk of you guys watching will have had some sort of bird take your soul and crush it. That's why it's so relatable when you realise this one fact, because when you're reading it just off the cusp, it's like, hair? Really? That was his strength? No, there's more to it. Now, before you start, slicing your genitals off to avoid this kind of thing, you've got to realise that these desires actually exist for a reason. There are different passions, like there's anger, there's hunger, there's sex, obviously. These all exist for a reason. There'd be no humans without that act. There would be no humans at all if you didn't eat. Like, you'd be dead within 1 generation without sex. Without anger, nothing would get done. If people weren't pissed off at certain things, they wouldn't finally, knock them on the head. There wouldn't be injustices corrected, Like, of course these things exist for a reason. The thing is that you have to do is that you have to get them in a proper order so they don't stitch you up. So how the heck do we actually do this? How do we get our desires in line with what our nature is? Well, it's very simple. We kind of drift to them when we realise that disordered desires lead us into unhappiness, because like, if you can say anything about Epstein, you know, clearly he's unhappy, he's inside. I mean, I've already commented on Bill Clinton looking like a zombie, and I suspect very strongly that Samson, after he had his momentary pleasure, felt his bald head and was like, crikey, this ain't good. You discipline them, and you do that through reading, understanding where the midpoint lies, and you do it by following an essential conscience, because you know when you're doing something wrong a lot often. You know when you're indulging in some sort of pleasure that could stitch you in the end anyway, at least if you've got two brain cells to rub together. So for example, if you see some bird who's like wanted to get on with you at like a nightclub or something like that, you probably want to say no because you don't know where she's been. Likewise, if you're at work and there's some woman working there who's potentially even married, like sometimes people won't wear their rings and stuff like that, like don't do it because not only can it fuck your career up, you could also have to deal with a husband. And I'm pretty sure that you'd rather not deal with the husband for the sake of maybe half an hour of pleasure at most, right? You got to think these things through. You got to get that superego, you know, your intellect dominating over your passions, and that is when you stop yourselves from doing stupid shit like this. And eventually it becomes a habit, and eventually you end up being happier because you've got your desires in order. Because you don't anymore desire to do these sorts of things. All it takes is a bit of effort. Now, of course, to get really, really good at it is a heroic effort. You know, like, the ultimate aim of a lot of the writings of Christianity is to be able to control yourself utterly, even in the harshest circumstances, right? Like, most people can control themselves in a bar after a couple of pints with an attractive woman, right? But what about if you've got 5 attractive women around you after you've had 10, and they're all offering, right? That's hard. And that's why we have a lot of writings that we do, because these sorts of situations come about all the time. They can often come about in our own heads, and it's important to get control of that. Constantly have your intellect over your feelings and your passions. And unfortunately, in this secular culture where we're told all the time to just follow our passions, you want to bang that bird, why not? You want to eat that food, eat that pint of ice cream, yeah, go ahead. No, you cannot do that if you want to be successful, because you will end up being enslaved by those things. And we don't really have many writings about it. So I'm going to recommend 2 here. The first one is the Desert Fathers, and this is translated by Benedicta Ward. Get it on the internet, it's really good. And the second one, which I'm actually recording for the Renaissance Man program, which you can get down in that description box, is a part of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, which was written by a Spanish poet called St. John of the Cross, which is essentially about disciplining your internal passions and your thoughts utterly to the point where you can, as he puts it, attain divine union, attain God. But for many of you here who are more secular, it'll probably be very, very useful just to reduce the amount of vices that can utterly control you. And the final thing I'd like to say, which is often winds people up for some reason, I've never quite figured out why, is that you could very, very easily become somebody like Bill Clinton if you just stopped controlling that particular vice. Very, very quickly, vices become habits and they screw you over. And this can apply to anything. There's a reason why serial killers exist, because they've done the one vice and it's become a habit, Same with, sex addicts, same with drug addicts. These things easily become habits. And for some reason, I've talked to lefties, and they get really, really angry that I insinuate that they could be potentially controlled by a certain vice. And I have no particular idea why. Probably because they already are and they don't want to admit it. But if you take one thing from this video, it's that you need to watch your vices so they don't control you. That is the message of this video. If you haven't heard anything else, and you want one thing to take away, it's that. Thank you very much for watching. I'd like to thank the people on the Renaissance Man program who you'll see on screen. They've helped me so much over the last couple of months, and hopefully they've received good and satisfactory content from the Renaissance Man program, which you can find in the description of the video. Thank you very much for watching.